Great. So today we will begin our reading of Grendel, but I want to recap and finish up talking about the myth of Sisyphus first. And whenever I teach Sisyphus, the story of monotony, repetition, and finding meaning in a mundane world, well, there's just one movie that comes to mind. And so I like to use this opening clip in order to get into the mind of Sisyphus. And it's also a Friday, so it's a good day, I think, to show a movie clip. So I'm going to show you the opening few minutes from the movie Office Space. Any of you have seen Office Space?
Woo!
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies, cinematic classic. If you haven't seen it, you're in for a treat. I'd encourage you to watch the rest of it. I mean, I will say that there's some inappropriate language in it, trigger warning, but you're all like 17 or 18, so you should be fine. So as we watch this, you'll see it's the title Office Space is about this guy going to work in his office cubicle job. My question for you, though, is what similarities do you see between the protagonist Peter and Sisyphus? And what details in particular, visual details, filmmaking effects, things like that, do you see that contribute to this presentation of the ideas of existentialism in this story? But there, so much great content communicated through not an enormous amount of dialogue, but just scene setting. So I'll go back to my question: the myth of Sisyphus. How do you see that reflected here in this clip? How is Peter Gibbons kind of a modern day Sisyphus? Start us off, Max.
Yeah, so you kind of have like the idea of doing something to the effect it kind of won't come to fruition or budge. For example, he was kind of stuck in traffic, like as much effort he put into that, like switching the lanes, he was kind of Sisyphus in that there was still traffic, and as much he tried to work through it, he would always be stuck in the slower lane. And then when you go to the PPS reports, as much as he tried to explain himself, like, oh, yeah, I just forgot this one time, everyone just kept loading it on him. And that kind of represents, like, at least when it comes to Sisyphus, the constant struggle of as much as you try to explain yourself, you're not going to get through.
Yeah, perfect. Good. Leo, what else did you see?
And I'd also add the element of, I'm not sure the exact word, but I guess uselessness. Like, Sisyphus is rolling up, like, the boulder for all eternity, but it's just going to keep falling back down. So, like, what he's doing is, like, maybe redundant, but that's also not the word. It's, like, futile, I guess. And with, like, the cover letter of the TPS report, whatever it is, like, the company's going to still, like, the company will be fine without it. And it's also the idea that you have I think it was 3 people who took it upon themselves, who it's part of their role to enforce this ultimately meaningless, like, benign policy. So it's like just the idea that much as Sisyphus is trapped doing something that's kind of circular and useless for all eternity, there's people who are stuck doing things that don't really matter and don't really serve a grander purpose for all eternity or until they retire.
Yeah, great. I mean, TPS reports have become synonymous in like the English lexicon as like meaningless bureaucratic nonsense reports that you have to fill out just because. And not only is it like some meaningless report, who knows what it's about, doesn't really matter. Like you point out, it's just the cover sheet. Like it's literally just the decoration on top that he got wrong. It's nothing to do with substance. And then he has 3 people coming around to tell him, like, kind of passive aggressively, like, hey, you need to do it. Totally not listening to him when he's telling him that it's just an innocent mistake.
What is the purpose of a TPS report? Does it like fulfill any duty?
It's not a real thing. Like Mike Judge just invented it for the purposes of the movie, as far as I know. He was actually Mike Judge who made the movie, also created Beavis and Butthead, also made the movie Idiocracy. and he had a couple others, but these are the ones he's most famous for. Worked as, I forget what kind of engineer, but he was working as an engineer before he became a filmmaker. And so took a lot of what he personally experienced living in this cubicle reality every day and brought it into film form. So that's a lot of what's behind it. What other details did you notice that convey this sense of like existential anxiety about the world? Daily, yeah.
Well, if you see with the Indian guy in his car, like he's so fed up with everything that like even the slightest thing of just traffic is like making him punch his steering wheel and curse ridiculously.
Yeah, it's interesting like watching the different characters' reactions to like the inconvenience of traffic. And in the greater scheme of things, traffic isn't really a big deal, but when you deal with it every single day, it can really set people off. Also, like, I just want to note quickly, I've been using this clip basically every year that I've taught. And every time I use it, like, I notice some little detail that's different that I didn't notice before. And something I just noticed this time around. Let me see if I could find it. This guy's like driving on the wrong side of his car. Wait, am I sharing now? Yeah. Because steering wheel's on. Oh, that's probably just a passenger. Never mind, I'm being dumb. But I saw that and I thought there was a steering wheel there, and I was like, is he like driving a car from England? Never mind. It's just Mr. LaLuna being silly. Okay, Isabel, go ahead.
I think at the beginning, like the way that the old man on the walker is like getting further ahead than he is driving, I feel like that shows how, like, not only does it suck to feel like you're stuck in this cycle and that is no escape, kind of like how Sisyphus, thank you, Sisyphus, is like going on this endless loop, but also like the social pressure of thinking that everyone else is getting like further ahead than you are can make everything feel worse.
Yeah, that's another great detail, seeing that guy with the walker, and the constant back and forth. Repetition, I think, is an important part of Sisyphus's torture as well as Peter Gibbons' torture. In the first paragraph of the Myth of Sisyphus, it says, the gods, had thought with some reason that there was no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. So it's work, but it's specifically work that doesn't have an end result. You just do it. It's always the same process day after day, nothing different. Any other details that you saw? Especially that idea of repetition. Yeah, Sophia.
When he was like trying to tell the guy to stop playing the music, and then the guy just kind of kept saying the same thing over and over again, like, oh, I was told I could do this from this time, and it's like, as much as he was trying to like just ask him to stop, he just like kind of repeated the same thing over and over again.
Right, like it seems like it shouldn't be a big deal, but just asking for this favor. There's like a breakdown in communication as well, like Peter living in this moment and like trying to just like get through his day, and then there are all these people who are impressing themselves onto his life and making things a little more inconvenient. And any other like kinds of small inconveniences that he has to deal with? Leo?
This is kind of going off of Sophia's point, but like this isn't on the main character, but the dude who's just listening to the radio, like some like person who has power over him is like designated when he can and cannot like listen to the radio at a reasonable volume. And it's just like the most arbitrary, useless thing. So like if it's not bothering anyone, like who cares? It's like whatever.
It's true, more of those nonsensical bureaucratic rules, and he's sitting at the bus stop saying, if I'm late again, I'm going to be summarily dismissed. And so there's a lot at stake, even though it's just seemingly, pointless work. I was wondering if anyone noticed, I was going to talk about the static shock when he enters the the main office space for the first time. He goes to open the door and he pauses in front of the doorknob because he knows what's going to happen. And he touches the doorknob and then gets the static shock. And it's static shock. It's not a big deal. It doesn't really hurt. But you can see the anguish in his face knowing, this happened last week. It's going to happen again. It's going to happen for the next however many years I work at this place. I also love the woman who's his cubicle mate. He goes to sit down and she's, corporate accounts payable, Nina speaking, just a moment, over and over again, more of that sense of repetition. It's just like the high-pitched voice, the sing-song way of speaking just can get under your skin. So it's a nice depiction of how modern day work has become this kind of Sisyphean struggle. And Albert Camus, when he was writing the myth of Sisyphus, in part was writing this with the proletariat, the working class in mind. And he was imagining Sisyphus as a sort of hero for laborers. Right? Sisyphus's punishment is supposed to be a physical one, like rolling this really heavy object up a hill, but really the punishment isn't physical. Right? He writes, if this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. What exactly does he mean by that? Sure, Leo.
I mean, like, I think it's just knowing that what you're doing is redundant and useless and that it'll never have a purpose. Like, people can get past physical pain. Like, that's a relatively, like, basic thing. But there's, like, multiple layers of, like, anguish that come with the sense of, like, having no purpose and having no meaning and not being fulfilled. So that's more torturous than just basic physical exertion.
Yeah, good. Anyone want to add anything to that? Okay, yeah, it's because Sisyphus is thinking that this is problematic at all. And yet the myth of Sisyphus is very different than Office Space, at least in this scene, because we have to imagine Sisyphus as happy. So again, what is it that Sisyphus has that Peter Gibbons in Office Space doesn't have? They're both doing futile tasks, and yet Sisyphus is happy and Peter isn't. I would also welcome hearing from someone new. You know, what is the thing that existentialists say is the only way to create a meaningful life? Sure, let's hear from Alex.
I think kind of an acceptance that life is like this and an acknowledgement that, like, Sisyphus acknowledges that the task is meaningless, but chooses not to be bothered by the meaninglessness of the task in of itself, whereas the other guy doesn't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that choice of what perspective do you want to take on this work? Do you want to choose to find meaning in it, or do you not want to? Leo, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, this isn't necessarily from an existential point of view, but Sisyphus, or where the office dude technically has a way out, Sisyphus doesn't. Like, Sisyphus is going to be doing that for all eternity, so, like, he's going to have to, like, find some way to cope with it. So, like, assigning meaning to arbitrary, useless things is, like, what he has to do. But with the office worker, like, there is technically a way out. He could just, like, quit or find a different job. So it's, like, different. In one situation, you have just kind of, like, reluctant complacency, and in another, you have, like, no way out. So that kind of gives insight into, I guess, who the characters are, if that makes sense, like, as people.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, what's interesting about this comparison is I kind of feel like Camus is right where Office Space is wrong. And I think it's popular in our culture to criticize office work and cubicle work and, like, present the message that the only way to live a meaningful life would be to quit your desk job, sell all your belongings, fly to like Thailand, become an Instagram influencer, and just take pictures of yourself on the beach doing yoga and like travel from place to place and write about it. And I think like Camus would be saying like, hey, that's the wrong approach. His audience is, you know, French laborers in the mid 20th century. That's not like a thing that you can do. Rather, it's advocating for kind of radical acceptance of things as they are, and that choice to see things as meaningful, even though they might not be at first blush. So keeping that in mind, let's turn back to existentialism. But I want to go to something completely different. This is just funny. But my objective for today, we've talked a bit about existentialism and Sisyphus already. I also now want to talk about Beowulf, because we're going to be reading Grendel over the weekend, so you ought to know a little bit about the characters, plot, and setting that inspired it. And again, today, read for this weekend, read chapters 1 through 2. I'll also tell you that notes are going to be due on Grendel for next Friday, so if you want to do notes on chapters 1 through 2, you're welcome to. But before we talk about Beowulf and Grendel more, I just wanted to say one subgenre of existentialism is the absurd and absurdism. So we talked about existentialism yesterday as a philosophical system, and it exists as that. It also exists, though, as an aesthetic and an artistic movement. And you can have films that are existential, even if they're not directly philosophical. Existential films are generally, you know, dreary, feature protagonists in these kind of repetitive situations, and often absurd situations. So when I say absurd, I'm not just talking about strange or ridiculous or dumb. I'm talking about an inherent conflict in someone trying to find meaning in the nihilist's world that doesn't have an innate meaning. Okay, that struggle to see something that's not there, or search for something that's not there, is at the heart of absurdism, right? Grendel too is going to have some of this absurdism. There are some famous examples of this. One might be Waiting for Godot, a play by Samuel Beckett. Sometimes it's taught in the high school. The play features two guys, Vladimir and Estragon, who are on stage waiting for this other guy, Godot, to show up. The whole play is them sitting on stage waiting, making small talk as they wait, and Godot never shows up. And that's the play. A kind of absurd situation, kind of showing that tendency to wait for something and hope for something to show up that never happens. Same with the Metamorphosis. I know some of you are writing about Kafka for your research paper. The Metamorphosis is his most famous story about a guy, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one day to find out he's a giant bug. No explanation given, and his reaction when he discovers that he's been transformed is not, oh my God, I'm a bug. It's, oh shoot, how am I going to get to work as a bug? How am I going to put my pants on if I'm a giant beetle? That's not good, right? So more of that absurdity. Again, we'll see that with Grendel. Okay, now for something completely different. I told you yesterday, Grendel is a combination of these existential ideas with Old English and Old English stories. So I want to just mention some Old English things. I know you guys talk about the Anglo-Saxons in AP Human Geography, so this might sound a little bit familiar, but let me refresh your memory. The Anglo-Saxons were a group of people, kind of the first English people, you might say. There were people who were inhabiting the British Isles before they showed up. The Anglo-Saxons filled the void after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So post 450 AD or so, that's when they started to show up. Celtic tribes were inhabiting the British Isles before then, the Britons, one of those tribes. But the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic people who came with them, brought their language. People say English is a Germanic language, and that's why, because it was brought over by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. They also brought with them their folklore. And note that they're from northern Germany, Denmark. So the stories that they were bringing were Scandinavian, Norse stories. And Beowulf, even though it's an English story, an English epic, takes place in Denmark, right? And this is why it was brought over by them. So Beowulf is the story of a mead hall that's under attack. A mead hall was the heart of Anglo-Saxon life. Mead you might have heard of. It's a type of wine made not from grapes, but from fermented honey. This is what Anglo-Saxons would drink instead of water, in addition to water, but water is just purified water is harder to come across. The mead hall where you would drink this was sort of a combination between a city hall and a bar. It's the place where you would go to hang out with your buddies after a battle. It's also the place that the king or warlord would make decrees and govern. It would also function as a fort if you were under attack. This is the place you'd hide out. So it's really the center of civic life. And in Beowulf, the story, the mead hall of a guy named King Hrothgar is under attack by this monster, Grendel. We don't know much about Grendel. He's not really described in detail. He's kind of like this troll-like being. That's how he's usually interpreted. It's said that he has descended from Cain, the first murderer, and he hears people making merry in the mead hall, which just makes him totally enraged. And so he can't stand anyone else being happy. He comes, breaks down the doors, and kills indiscriminately. The soldiers of Hrothgar, King Hrothgar, his knights, the Old English term for this is thanes. A thane is an Old English knight. Try to fight back, but they're basically powerless to do anything against Grendel. So that's where Beowulf comes in. So this story about this great hero, Beowulf, had been told through oral poetry for hundreds of years before it was eventually written down, probably by a Christian monk who inserted his own ideas about Christianity. So it's a pagan story, but it has Christian ideas imposed onto it. It's kind of a mixture of both. And it tells the story of Beowulf. We're not quite sure what the word Beowulf means, but probably it comes from Beo, which was Old English for bee, and wolf that meant hunter. So he's a bee hunter. That is to say he's a bear. So it probably just means bear. This super strong warrior, almost superhuman warrior, who comes from Sweden and sails over to help out King Hrothgar. So Beowulf lives in the tribe, with his tribe, the Geats in southern Sweden, and he sails over to Denmark to help Hrothgar defeat Grendel. Basically how the story goes is there are three main battles that form Beowulf. The first battle is against Grendel, and it's a pretty straightforward fight. Beowulf shows up and says, "Here, I have a plan. I'm going to pretend to be sleeping tonight, and Grendel will show up, and then I'll lay a trap for him." So he pretends to be sleeping. Grendel comes in, kills a few soldiers, comes across Beowulf, says, "Oh, here's a new guy. I'm going to kill him." Reaches down, rip Beowulf apart, and then Beowulf springs up, grabs Grendel's arm, rips Grendel's arm out of its socket. Grendel runs away, bleeds to death in his lair, and that's it. So it's like not even a big fight, and Beowulf hangs up Grendel's arm as a trophy in the top of the mead hall. So that's monster one. Monster two then is Grendel sulks back home and dies. Grendel's mom finds this out and isn't too happy that her son has been killed. So she starts attacking the mead hall. Then Beowulf's like, "Great, my work's not done." He goes to Grendel's mother's lair and fights Grendel's mother, defeats her in the lair, comes back victorious. So he's a great big hero. He sails back home to the land of the Geats, is crowned king for his great deeds, rules for 50 years. After 50 years, a dragon suddenly emerges, terrorizing his town. He has one last battle. He goes to defeat the dragon, kills the dragon, but is mortally wounded and dies as a great hero. And that's basically the story of Beowulf. Very traditional story of a heroic, epic hero who defeats evil. John Gardner, author of Grendel, decided to turn that on its head and say, hey, like, what about this Grendel? What was his perspective in this whole thing? And uses Grendel as the mouthpiece for Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophical views. So even though it's a story that takes place in Old English times, it feels more like a postmodern philosophical book. Okay. So I think it'll be, see how much time do we have? I think it might be fun to read the beginning of Grendel together. So I know a number of you have your books. There's also a copy of the story online. You can find it on Canvas. And look at the first couple paragraphs together. I'll just share my screen so you can see it. So the object of interest in this novel is Grendel's voice. Like, it's a character-driven novel. I'll just give you a warning about Grendel and this passage I'm about to read. Grendel is very vulgar and inappropriate. There's some inappropriate references, be warned. But it's also kind of funny and interesting, and I'm going to read it anyway. So here are just the first couple of paragraphs. So consider how Grendel is being portrayed, what kind of attitude this monster has. So here's the very beginning. The old ram stands looking down over the rock slides, stupidly triumphant. I blink. I stare in horror. Scat, I hiss. Go back to your cave. Go back to your cowshed, whatever. He cocks his head like an elderly, slow-witted king, considers the angles, decides to ignore me. I stamp. I hammer the ground with my fists. I hurl a skull-sized stone at him. He will not budge. I shake my two hairy fists at the sky and let out a howl so unspeakable that the water at my feet turns sudden ice, and even I myself am left uneasy. But the ram stays. The season is upon us, and so begins the 12th year of my idiotic war. The pain of it, the stupidity. Ah, well, I sigh and shrug, trudge back to the trees. Do not think my brains are squeezed shut like the ram's by the roots of horns. Flanks a tremble, eyes like stones, he stares at so much of the world as he can see and feels it surging in him, filling his chest as this melting snow fills dried out creek beds, tickling his gross lopsided balls and charging his brains with the same unrest that made him suffer last year at this time, and the year before, and the year before that. He's forgotten them all. His hind parts shiver with the usual joyful, mindless ache to mount whatever happens near. The storm piling up black towers to the west, some rotting, docile stump, some Spraddle Lake view. I cannot bear to look. Why can't these creatures discover a little dignity? I ask the sky. The sky says nothing, predictably. I make a face, uplift the defiant middle finger, and give an obscene little kick. The sky ignores me, forever unimpressed. Him too I hate, the same as I hate these brainless budding trees, these prattling birds. All right, I just like the part where he flips off the sky. That seems like very Grendel. So what do you make of this guy? What are your reactions to his voice? Leo.
It's almost like an angsty teenager in a way, just getting upset that the goats that won't run away or go back to their cowshed, whatever.
Yeah, good. Angsty teenager is a nice way to describe it. He is a very whiny character. He's a very emo character. Some people find that endearing. Some people find that annoying. I have sympathy for him, but yeah, Grendel, get it together. Good. Isabel.
I feel like already the author has characterized him like we kind of tell that he's not human, that he's a monster. Like just from the sentences, they're very like simple, and they all have like I do this, I do this. And like his anger is very clear. It's a little bit crude. So I think right off the bat we know what kind of character like Grendel is going to be.
Yeah, good. There is this like propensity for random exclamations, for like shifting focus rapidly, and for sudden anger, and then kind of indifference. And then we could, get into this beginning passage, because this paragraph itself tells you a lot of what you need to know about him, and shows, I think, that the central paradox of Grendel, right? There's this old ram, and Grendel is this big, scary troll monster who's been killing the strongest men in this mead hall. And yet, despite all that, he can't scare away a ram. Like he hisses at it, he throws a rock, he screams as hard as he can, so loudly that he himself is left feeling uneasy, and the ram's just like, yeah, I don't care. So he's both powerful and yet powerless, which is an important thing to understand, I think, about him. Sophia?
Just like that kind of like comparison kind of reminds me of like the Grinch, because like he's like this big bad like scary like angsty guy, but then like the like sweetest little girl isn't even scared of him. So it's, I don't know, it just reminded me of that.
That's so funny, because someone pointed that out in my second period, and no one has said that when I've taught Grendel before. But yeah, I totally agree with that. He's like both menacing, but also there's something kind of like goofy and charming about him. It's a weird combination. Right? And then we see here also some hints about the plot. So begins the 12th year of my idiotic war. There's that Sisyphean repetition. He's been at war for 12 years. The war is idiotic and pointless. We could kind of infer from the background I gave that the war he's talking about is the war with Hrothgar, going in to kill all the Thanes every day. Anything else you notice about the opening of Grendel? All right, well, you'll learn more over the weekend as you read those 2 chapters. By the way, I'll just point out, do they have them in this? I don't think I guess they don't have them in this online version, but if you have a physical book, there are some cool illustrations of Grendel that are included that are kind of neat to look at. So you could, if you have any thoughts on those, I'll hear them too. All right, that's it for today. Any questions for me?